Okay, thank you again, everybody that is here on today's webinar. Welcome to IDRA's free webinar series on equitable practices for online learning, which is designed to support educators, families, students, and other educational stakeholders during this unprecedented event. So this is our webinar series. Thank you for joining today's webinar, which is entitled The Impact of COVID on Bilingual Education. Thank you again for joining. For all of our participants that are here with us, please jot down your name, pronoun, role, location in the chat so that we can kind of see who's in the room with us today. I am Dr. Stephanie Garcia, IDRA's Education Associate. I'm so glad to be here with you today. Again, please introduce yourself in the chat box. I'd love to know who's joining us for today's webinar. I am privileged to introduce today's guest speaker, Grace Delgado, Executive Director of Multilingual Services at Aldine ISD. Grace, thank you so much for joining today's webinar. We know you are extremely busy. This is a very busy week, especially. We appreciate you sharing your knowledge and experiences with us as we discuss the impact of COVID on bilingual education and emergent bilinguals.
Thank you so much for having me today. I look forward to the conversation this afternoon.
Thank you. We appreciate you, Grace. And I know you pretty well now, but I would love for you to expand a little bit more on your educational experiences, your present role as a multilingual educator. And I know you, but I think our listeners would really appreciate a little bit more about you and as a quick introduction before we get started.
So I'll share a little bit about my professional and my personal life because it forms the whole person that I am. I am born and raised in Puerto Rico. I went to school to be a teacher in Puerto Rico. And then I got married to a guy that was military. So we ended up in a few states before arriving to Texas. So we've been in Texas for 20 years. And in Texas, I have been able to work at multiple districts, and I have been a bilingual teacher. I've been a literacy coach. I've been a school administrator. And then for the last 6, going on my 7th year, I have been working at the central office level, and I have worked here in curriculum writing and now in the language department. I am, like I mentioned, I've been married for the last 26, going on 27 years, and I have 3 children. I have a 20-year-old, I have a 17-year-old, and I have a 12-year-old. And I always like to mention my family piece. Because my son, it's under the umbrella of special education. So I live in an interesting intersection as an English learner myself, as a bilingual person myself. I live in this world of biliteracy all day, every day, but I also live in the world of special education as the parent of a special education child. So advocacy, it's my bread and butter 24/7.
Thank you so much for introducing yourself to everybody. Again, thank you for being with us today. And, we've got to practice these good educator moves, right? So let's go ahead and start our webinar with a good teaching technique, which is just a quick review of terminology. Within this webinar description alone, there are multiple phrases such as emergent bilinguals, bilingual education, and multilingual education. So I'd like to take a moment to engage with all of our participants in today's webinar. If everyone can just glance at these terms and rate your level of understanding of these terms in the chat box, that would be super helpful. A 1 would mean that you maybe have little knowledge of these terms. A 5 would mean that you have expert knowledge of these terms. And this will really help Grace and I before we move forward. So I'll give everybody a second to go ahead and begin rating. That way we can take a moment to check out the chat room. Thank you so much for everybody's engagement. It's much appreciated. So it's a good range for sure. I see a little bit of everybody in this room. Grace, do you mind briefly describing these terms for all of today's listeners, just to kind of help set the context and the foundation for today's webinar?
I think these terms are interesting because there has been this evolution in bilingual education in regards of terms. Our bilingual label stems from, people learning two languages. But what we have learned in our journeys through education is that we have students that have multiple languages. We have multilingual students. We have kids that come to us with more than one language already, some of them being native language or tribal languages, depending where they come from. Some of those languages have alphabets like ours, and some of them don't, but they're still languages. So English has become a new language for them. The term of emergent bilingual, it's a term that has been started because it wants to look at multilingualism through an additive lens. For the longest time, our kids were coded and still coded in some places as LEP, which is limited English proficiency, which is looking at it through a deficiency lens. They're deficient in something. And we are in the process, at least in Texas, we're in the process of transitioning to the new English learner language, even for coding purposes. So they're still learning English. So it's more at the lens of changing the lens of how we're addressing language needs with our students, and seeing it as a more additive way. This is an additional language that they're getting.
Got it. That makes sense. Yes, there's always kind of different trends that we see in our vocabulary, and I know that's something we've been talking a lot about at IDRA as an organization, is using maybe emergent bilinguals or something like that, just to make sure that we're always viewing things through an asset lens, right? So it's that lens and approach that's super important. I want to go ahead and also do another good teacher move. All educators kind of practice this. Let's look at data. Let's go ahead and start the discussion with data, just to truly understand the current landscape of bilingual education. And I would love for everybody that's on the call today to engage with you again. If you have any kind of important data or emerging research that you'd like to share for the good of the group, use our chat room. Go ahead and share anything that you like in there as far as data or research that's really helping kind of inform your work in your region especially. Grace, I know that you and your district have put together some key pieces of data. Let's go ahead and jump in and start to examine that.
So I've been looking at some of these information. I have been having meetings with our leadership. And I always like to center myself in data, in qualitative and quantitative data. So this is a graphic that I like to use when we're presenting, because it speaks to the multilingual population, the students that are English learner coded in our states. And now the most current data that we can find through Department of Education, which is this graphic, is from 2017. It's still lagging because of the collection of points of data throughout the states. So the graphic is interesting because it tells us that the average percentage for the United States as a nation is 10%, meaning 10% of students currently enrolled in schools in the United States are coded English learners. But as you can tell by the colors on the map on the states, there's a big variation of percentages. California has the most, at least 2 years ago, with 19.2%, but right above California, it's Oregon with 8.8%. So it shows the vast variation, which brings up the needs. The needs are going to be very different based on where we're located. Now, the next slide, I also like to put this slide because we have some misconceptions about the students that we have in our classrooms in regards of these multilingual learners. There's this misconception that they must be new arrivals. And the reality is that the data has shown us that most of the students that are in programs right now, bilingual ESL programs that are currently Ells, are born and raised in the United States. So what this is telling us is that these students are being immersed in more than one language. Now, there's a variation in regards of their academic language in either one of them, but they have most of them have the codes. They're ready to go. And that's what we see a lot of our trends in schools now. It's not as much newcomers, but native borns. And as a person that has been in Texas for 20 years, it has been interesting living through this, seeing how most of our families are, some of our kids are third, fourth generation now. They're established in the States, but their main language at home might still be something other than English, for whatever reason, because a lot of them are keeping their language, they're keeping it straight because we have multi-generational families, households. So it's a misconception we like to address when we're presenting our data. Now this is a fact sheet that has been shared by the Texas Education Agency, the EL department, and they have gathered the Texas-specific information here. So this information is a little bit more current because it has it updated to 2019. And it tells us that in Texas, about 20% of the population of the current enrolled students are English learners. Like it breaks it down there, it means 1 in 5 students are ELs. But what I like to also mention is that the amount of languages that are found in Texas, that's another misconception that we like to talk about. We see the students and we think bilingual, we think Hispanic, must be Spanish. Spanish is the most spoken language, but it's not the only one. In Texas, there's over 120 languages spoken in different percentages, but there's a high population of other languages as well. And depending where you are in the state, that's how you have your variations in regards of language. Somebody mentioned on the chat the information about long-term ELLs. Our long-term ELs, these are students that have been coded ELs for 5 years or more. And we'll talk a little bit about reclassification process and all of those things, but it varies depending on the school district, really. This is data that is collected every year through multiple sources, and it varies. We have districts that have high percentages of English learners, but we have districts that have lower percentages. So there is a big variation based on programming and services at the school district. Now, I will have to say before we move, because I don't have a slide with the Aldine specific information. So we said that nationally we have 10% of students coded as EL, and in Texas we have 20% of students. In Aldine ISD, we have about total demographics, total number of students. It's about 64,000 students. So we have about 24,000 students that are English learners. So 39% of our population, we're double the amount of the state. And we have over 30 languages spoken. So we have a district that has 80 schools, 82 schools. And the needs are broad within the district. Our pockets of population are very different campus by campus. We have campuses that have a smaller population, and we have campuses that have over half of their population coded as EL. So as a district, we look at the data closely because, again, that's going to affect how we're servicing students, how we're addressing their programming, their needs, and how we're helping teachers help their students with their specific needs in programming.
Absolutely. No, those are wonderful points. I love infographics like this, and I love that, you know, we're taking that funnel approach. We're looking at it across the US and then diving in. I know we got somebody from Canada too. So I always encourage everybody to look at your data, look at your region. What does it look like? Look at your campus, because again, you know, looking at this map here, although it's helpful, I would have never known that Aldine ISD had like double, right, of the amount of emergent bilinguals in their district. That's really important to know and really helps inform and frame our work moving forward. So going back to the title of this webinar, the impact of COVID, what does this mean? What does this look like right now? I know that many schools have various forms of instructional settings right now, from face-to-face settings, hybrid settings, remote settings. And I would love to know, I'm always curious, based on everybody that's here in the webinar, feel free to add in the chat just a quick poll. What type of instructional setting are you currently in your schools? Is it face-to-face, hybrid, remote? I know things are constantly shifting and changing right now, but I just am always curious to kind of read the room to see what's happening in everybody else's regions. And Grace, how do we really adapt in ways that set up all emergent bilingual students for success?
And this is the magic question for the conversation. The reality is that our students' language needs are there. They didn't go away with COVID. And we had to adapt. So thankfully, we're in a district that took a very proactive approach in regards of training and start working with our teachers. Our work since the summer. So the interesting thing is that I joined Aldine right in the middle of the pandemic. Like I actually joined Aldine after the shutdown. So I started here in the middle of the pandemic through virtual meetings. But there was a lot of work we had to do. We had to look at all the concerns we have in regards to our students. How are they getting assessed? So for the people that don't know, when our emerging bilinguals come to school districts, there is a home language survey they have to fill out, and pending on that information, there's a language assessment that has to happen. For the longest time, we didn't know what was going to happen with the language assessment because we didn't have an alternative. So we were put on hold for a little bit in order to get the information from the state to actually know that we could do them face-to-face, or we could do them remotely, or we could do them virtually. So there were a lot of moving pieces in there. But then once students are identified, we have to think about what's the best setting for them. So the committee still had to meet and had to make those decisions for their students. And then we moved into how was the district opening. We had students that were virtual, and then we started transitioning to the face-to-face. But then the variations are amazing because we have face-to-face and we have virtual. But we also, when we started the transition, we had a hybrid approach for a few weeks, which meant some students were coming some days, not every day of the week. And what we have now is what we're starting to call concurrent teaching. So we have some classrooms that are having to do face-to-face and virtual simultaneously sometimes. And this has to do with the changes that we have. We have students that are changing the modalities. The virus is still active. We have students that are testing positive. The concern about scheduling. And in the midst of all of this, in the midst of trying to figure this out for all students, our kids have specific needs. Our kids' instruction still needs additional scaffolds for language, because if they're learning English, they cannot access the content in the same way. We need to add pieces to it. There's some accommodations we need to provide that have been determined by a committee that are non-negotiables. These are legal documents that say you must do these things for these children. So then we had to become very creative and look at how can we do that in these virtual settings. And then we have to test it out. So in the world of Zoom or Google Meets or Teams, how do you get the kids to participate in the language? How do you get to have these conversations with the students? And something that I have had to experience as a mother with my own children is the lack of privacy in a Zoom meeting. If I am struggling, do I say it out loud because everybody else is watching me? I don't have that corner in the classroom to talk to my teacher. If I'm a high school student, do I acknowledge that? Because my peers are watching and we're teenagers and we're cool, right? So how do we create those moments? Do we do a phone call? Do we do a visit? Do we do, we had teachers that had office hours in small groups and um, videos, and we had to be very creative and try everything possible because we knew that the kids needed us. We knew that the parents needed us too. So we had to bridge that somehow.
Absolutely. Yeah, I know you made some really great points. Thinking about the impact of families. I know we're going to get to that very soon. Um, we're doing the best that we can and we're moving quick. I know all educators at the drop of the hat are trying to come up with new things that are working for their students that benefit all of their students. And, looking at some other non-negotiables, right? Serving all students, making sure all of our students get their services, that's a non-negotiable. And then we see all of these other moving targets that are happening at the same time. And I know that, these are a few non-negotiables on the left that we're navigating through. Sometimes it feels like we're navigating in the blind as well. Can you tell us more about some of these items from your own perspective and lens?
So definitely non-negotiables. We look at our standards and we know that, COVID happened and we moved on to the next grade level, but we also have to acknowledge that we had kids that did not receive any, didn't have any access to instruction for anywhere between 3 and 6 months in some cases. So, people have been arguing the topic of learning loss as it that's testing language. What I have been trying to focus on is we know our kids need grade level standards. They need to, they're in a grade level and we teach to that standard. But we have some areas that we may not have taught. So it's not that it was lost. In some cases, it was never addressed because when we shut down during spring break, when we came back, instruction looked really different. And it was a lot of emergency teaching, a lot of navigating through standards, but we were not necessarily keeping the pace of instruction and covering the standards that we would have had we been face to face. So, and again, this is something that I see with my own children. I have a teacher that likes to tell me, remember, they learned that last year, and I keep thinking, where in the calendar did that fall? Because I'm not sure we actually had school at that time. So these are real concerns, that there is some kind of loss or gap. So we have to balance this somehow, knowing that we're on grade level, but we have to stretch ourselves because we might have to do a little bit more intervention just on content standards, just on like reading standards or math standards. We have to do a little bit more of an intervention to address that. Again, let's remember, our kids still have the language needs, so they need the additional scaffold. They may need an additional graphic organizer or an additional visual or an additional sentence stamps, like things that we do to support their learning English. In regards to the accountability, at least in Texas, we know that our numbers are going to look different. That is not going to account for our yearly accountability, but the tests are happening. The timelines have changed. We have been given wider windows to be able to provide assessments for our students. And we are in preparation for our language assessment. I know in other states, the windows have opened already for their access exams. Ours start in February. Our TELPAS, which is our language acquisition assessment, will start in February. So we're in the middle of preparing for what that entails. The tests are happening face-to-face. So that being said, we have to address what happens with students that have been doing virtual. The window has to be there. The window has been expanded so we can do smaller groups with more space. So we have a longer time to get all our students come to classrooms. We are having conversations. We actually had a conversation last week with some administrators trying to figure out our logistics of transportation. Like some of our kids may need transportation on those particular days for testing. And then something as simple as having to create a little bit of a permission slip. It's working a little bit like a field trip in some cases because we have to make adjustments in the buildings. If we're going to have a student testing the whole day, well, that student is not normally here because they're doing virtual. So we have to think, where are they going to go in the building to test, with who, and they're going to be here for lunch. We have to prepare lunch for them. So we are in the process of finding out things that we may not have known that we needed to be ready for, because our state assessments will happen towards the end of April and May. So at least I think TELPAS will give us some information of how to prepare for some of these areas. But even, shifting of timelines or shifting of windows. When we transitioned last year, a lot of our time was just waiting to hear about our timelines, because we knew we had some deadlines coming for certain things, but we also know that our state agency has to, everything that is done at the state level has to align to the federal government, to the federal guidelines for English learners. So we know that there were conversations that were happening with the state agencies to make sure that they were aligned with their guidelines as well. So we're waiting to hear from them in regards to timelines. And we had some timelines that we were close to having a deadline, and then we got information that things were expanded or extended, and the same thing happened in the fall. We had some assessments and we had a window to close, and then maybe a couple of weeks before the window was closing, we heard that there had been an extension for some additional testing. So right now, we have our timeline set by the commissioner, and we're planning accordingly. But we know that we get information every couple of weeks, and things could change. It could change based on the virus or based on any other changes happening at any federal or state level. So what doesn't change is the obligations that we have for our students. What doesn't change is that we must, not just the legal piece. Legally, we're bound to serve our students. But just the moral part. I mean, our students are students first, and we have to do what's best for them. So that doesn't go away. So we have to continue to understand what our parameters are by state and federal government, and then work through our timelines with it. I see a question about the LPACs, which is the committee. We have been providing support for our committees throughout. Again, our LPACs have had their dates, our committees have had their dates for completion of documentation. And we have had moments in which, actually there's somebody in the call that I see that it's one of our compliance people. It has been an all hands on board kind of, situation. Like if they need help, we're there. They have been, the compliance people have been, talking to their campuses, having question and answer sessions. I have had people go into buildings to help them, complete documentation if needed, because just like we have teachers and students that may be absent due to the virus, we have administrators sometimes that have to quarantine or have to be out for a while. So we are stretching ourselves everywhere we can just to make sure that our kids are served. That's the most important thing, that our kids are receiving the services they deserve.
Absolutely. Those are all really great points. These moving targets are real. The struggle is real. And sometimes you had mentioned too, these timelines or this critical information, it kind of trickles down a little late to some, right? And I think we've had some really great participation and engagement in the chat. looking at kind of enrichment summer camps, is that something that maybe your district is already talking about?
So we have started like tiny bit of information, although I have asked questions in December already, because we do know that we can gain some time during the summer. In addition to, one of the non-negotiables included for Texas at least is for our students that are in pre-K and kinder that are English learners, we have to provide a language intervention during the summer, like a special language summer school.
Mm-hmm.
And it has a certain amount of hours that has to happen. So we became very creative last year, and we were able to find some remote resources, in addition to some virtual camps that happen on campuses. So we were able to reach 100% of our pre-K and K students in Aldine through these additional resources. So thinking about that, I've already started asking questions about how we're anticipating summer happening. Because we lived through last year. So we know that we have to have multiple plans. On the perfect scenario, we're all face-to-face, we're all back, we're in classrooms. We know that we could be all virtual, and we are living through these concurrent hybrid moments. So I'm a big believer on planning ahead. So we're in the process of having some conversations about like how can we have these multiple scenarios so that way we can pivot as needed. The other, we are having a conversation about high school and some of our high school students, specifically newcomer students. We're starting to troubleshoot what are the best services. There are some classes that happen in the summer, but how would that look based on their needs? Because what we have found with our newcomers in high school, our numbers dropped a lot from last year to this year. We know that there was a lot of movement out of the district with newcomer students because of jobs. Families that lost jobs and they had to move with other families. Our district was very flexible has been very flexible with their classes and their assignments and allowing kids to complete work later in the day without penalty. Because another thing we found out with a lot of our newcomers is that they themselves are helping by getting jobs to help their parents. In addition to what we have all seen, which is some older students taking care of their younger siblings so their parents can work. So we had to take all those pieces into consideration when determining how to support our kids. So we know that our high school newcomer students may need a little bit more support in the summer if we can do that. And we also are looking into creating a language summer camp for some of our kids that are transitioning from elementary to middle schools, because that's when the programming changes for them. It goes from bilingual to ESL. So the supports look different, and they're now completely immersed in English only classrooms. So we want to be able to provide some transitional support in the summer before they go to their next building. So there's a lot of ideas going on. We're hoping to start like putting some things on paper, planning for our kids in the next month.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, those resources are all very important as students are promoted to different grade levels. That's very, very, very important that you all are considering all these different options. I'm looking at the chat. I saw there was I'm not sure what HLS, how do you assist new enrollees with HLS? I'm not sure.
So that's the home language survey.
The survey.
And in our schools, our campuses have been trained to have those conversations with the parents, and our platforms are all electronic. So they fill out the information there, and then there's communication between the campus and the parents. because based on the home language survey, then there's a determination of doing the language assessment for the kids. Our schools are open, so we are able to serve parents if they come face to face with the process if needed for any questions they have. So we have been able. The summer was a little tricky because of the documentation, and we did notice a drop in numbers with our pre-K students, but that was seen across the state. I think that had a lot to do with there's a couple of reasons. But there was the main concern. We have a lot of kiddos that we've heard from the parents that they have babies at home, so they don't want, any exposure at the campuses, or, they decided to create their little bubble at home with their kids, just for safety reasons. So we know that's another area that we have to be mindful of as we prepare for next year with some of our younger students as well.
I think we'll answer the next two when we get to our next slide, which is actually, it's a good little segue here, because the next kind of topic for our discussion is, all of this information that you've shared is really crucial for educators and emergent bilinguals and their families. And, these are some really great points here in the chat. How has COVID really impacted the families in your district, and what are ways you guys are pivoting? I think this is a good community of practice where we can learn from each other here.
I have to say, these transition into this district has been, even in the middle of the pandemic, has been a little bit of this magic that I've been able to see some of the fantastic services that are happening in Aldine. Aldine has a family and community engagement department, and there are representatives at every campus. So we know that parents needed information. We know that parents needed training so they could help their kids. So they went right on it. And from the beginning of this pandemic on to now, there are meetings that happen almost every other week. There's a calendar, it's every other week, with information, with trainings as needed. And we're offering, because the majority of our other language is Spanish, we have the meetings in English and in Spanish. So parents have that platform. We have had drive-throughs for them to pick up materials, and we've had them in multiple locations and at multiple times during the year. We're constantly doing the deployment of devices and helping the parents understand. There is still the website, there is still the hub for the learning at home that the parents have access to with the information that they need and the links that they need there. And the schools are going out to the parents. We have teams at campuses that are going out. If the kids didn't come, they went to look for them. If the kids didn't come enroll and fill paperwork out, they went out to look for them. If the kids didn't come pick up the materials, they went out to drop materials. So the amount of community support, the amount of school support to the community has been amazing to observe. And we're still doing it. We're still missing kids, and phone calls and check-ins and visits. They're still happening because we're trying to find our kids. We're trying to find our kids. We want them back in campuses. And that's how we know that some of them moved. That's how we know that some of them are no longer here because of whatever reason. Because we've gone out to try to find our kids.
I see here there are a couple specific questions regarding families. What is kind of Aldine's strategy of reaching out to? It sounds like your community family engagement department probably takes on some of these initiatives here. Are you guys reaching out to the parents, or are they reaching out to you? It seems like you've already answered that. It seems like it's both ways, right?
Yeah, it's both ways. If the parents are not reaching out, we're definitely reaching out to them. The other thing that has happened is that sometimes parents, if they change from an elementary to a middle or a middle to a high school, they may not have a point of contact. So a phone call may come somewhere else. A phone call may come to our office.
Mm-hmm.
So we have had some cases in which we have had parents call,
Mm-hmm.
trying to find out how they can do something or get, information or resources or go through the process of getting help.
Mm-hmm.
And we have been able to connect them to the right people at the right campus, so that way they can be, set for whatever their needs are.
And I'm sure in these meetings you described, they have these biweekly or weekly meetings. There's information that you talked about that's being disseminated. I'm sure some of that information includes parents having the option of opting out. That was one question from Cheryl.
So our parents, they get information through, there's reminders done. There's a lot of social media that the district is using.
Yes.
So our parents can opt in or out every grading period.
Mm.
So there is a reminder set at that time. This is your period to opt in or like change the modality for your student, and you have until, certain time. So those reminders go every grading period. So that way, the schools have enough time to get the information to make the adjustments that they may need to do at their buildings.
Mm-hmm. And then it sounds like Aldine probably does this already with high schoolers getting information on scholarships and college options. Is that still happening and moving forward just virtually now?
Yes, there has been a few fairs that have happened already, and they have also had their FAFSA and eyes to help their students, but a lot of it is happening, some is happening face to face with smaller groups, but a lot of it has happened through remote settings. Our high schools are communicating that information to their students, and they're opening. Actually, we have even some schools that have started to do some tutoring sessions. And these tutoring sessions, we have tutoring that is happening for content, and we have tutoring that is starting for language as well.
Mm-hmm.
And some of these options are face to face, and some of the options are being offered remotely. So
Mm-hmm.
we're actually able to have more flexible settings for these interventions that we're doing as well.
That's great. That's great. We've got one more and then we're going to move on because Scarlett's question is a great segue to our next section. There was one lingering question I think I missed about the surveys again, something about what is your strategies or advice on managing duplicative submissions?
Um,
I don't know.
well, the submissions are going to the school, and the school still has to process it. So our LPAC people have to go through the process of creating the folders as well. So if they submit it, I mean, they're going to get the evidence. They're just doing their forms electronically. So we're still going to have to create, we're still creating folders, like physical folders.
Yeah.
So we're able to screen that way.
Good, good. Well, as Scarlett already helped us out here, transitioning to the next topic of really building capacities for educators and looking a little bit more of the learning materials that are being used in these different settings. What is working, what isn't working as far as lessons learned for our emergent bilingual educators, our students during this time?
Wow. And I think the biggest lesson that we've all learned during COVID in regards of our resources is that there was a lot of technology out there, and a lot of us were afraid to use it. We've been a little bit forced into trying out some things, and I have been witness to some great adaptations. Like people have grown in certain ways um, because it was absolutely needed. And what I hope, my hope, after we're all done with this and everything is good to go, is that we're able to keep some of those good pieces that we learned, that we don't go back to the way we were doing things, and we actually take the best out of these crises. And in some cases have been these technology that we're now using. So we jumped into trying out things. So, the Google Suite has all your slides and all these wonderful things you can do. But people started trying things. And in the trying of things, we started sharing information. So things like Flipgrade that lets you like record yourself. It's a great tool for listening and speaking for our kids. And it lets our kids do like short things and give feedback to each other. So there's some collaboration there. We have things like, Nearpods, which, create these engaging activities. We have Padlets, and we have Kami, which is one that I learned, which creates a writable PDF, and the kids can, instead of creating another form, you have it already there. So there's a lot of things that teachers are using, are trying out. My advice, and I have given this advice here, and I actually have given this advice to my kids' teachers. It's been less is more. I know a lot of the concern at the very beginning was getting that engagement from the kids, getting the kids to come, show up, and do the work. But that doesn't mean we need to do 5 different apps in one lesson. And that doesn't mean we're doing one app today and a different app tomorrow and a different app the next day, because it's overwhelming for the students, but it's overwhelming for the teacher who's having to prepare these behind the scenes, who sometimes has to learn it herself before preparing it. And something that we may not even have looked at is most resources, most of the instructional resources that we have at our schools, our adoptions, have technology embedded. So have we looked at some of that? Like we have an adoption that has interactive notebooks. So we can use those. Like we don't have to create a separate presentation for that. So maybe going there first, so we know it's aligned to our resources, and then just testing a couple of things. And sometimes it's okay to have just a meeting and let kids talk. I talk about this particular situation because it was when the year started. I was working remotely, and I was home, and I was sitting next to my son, who again, special education, with a Chromebook, having to manage, his screens. And it's the first day of school, and everybody's introducing themselves, and everybody had this Google slide activity with the All About Me. Here's the thing, and you're going to create these slides, and you're going to turn it in. And here's the Nearpod, and you're going to do this, and you're going to turn it in. And at no point the kids were talking. They were just doing this activity and turning it in. And then he had choir. And this wonderful teacher looked at his 15 kids on screen and said, we're going to introduce ourselves. I'm going to unmute you, and this is what you're going to do. You're going to tell us your name so we know how to pronounce it. You're going to tell us if this is your first or second year, and you're going to tell us who else at home has any musical abilities. And that was it. That was the interaction he needed. It was the perfect setting to he got to talk to his friends, and his friends got to talk to him, even though it was an introduction. So, sometimes we can slow down a little bit and let have those moments of interaction between the students, do our breakout rooms and let them talk and come back to the group. Just let them talk. Our kids need that, and they need the support, and they still need their visuals, and they still need their scaffolds. But we can do it. We can have that. We can still build relationships with our kids. Sometimes we just have to slow down a little bit with all the apps.
Absolutely. No, I couldn't agree more. And like Lori said too, I love that, just that social part that, many of us are missing, right? Being at home on our dining room tables or wherever our new offices are located. And, we miss the people that we're going to school with or that we're working with. And I think just that time to talk and socialize is so important. And I think you get just high quality kind of discussions happening that way, and just talking. Yeah, I love that. I think that's really important. And despite all of the plethora of tools that we talked about, I know that I'm about to share another tool that has really great online learning resources. But again, this is a really great resource that Aldine produced. It's a whole document full of online tools, and TEA published it. Can you explain for a moment? I'm going to drop the link in the chat for everybody, and it'll be tied to our webinar later. But can you briefly explain this resource, as well as, again, any others that we could share on our website afterwards?
So like I mentioned, in the middle of the pandemic, right after spring break, Aldine shut down, reorganized what we needed to do, and then started preparing for their teachers. One strand knew that we had to train our teachers. We use Schoology as our platform, so we knew we needed as much training as possible with our teachers, so they knew how to address the platform and how to prepare their classes and all that good stuff. But one of the pieces that this wonderful team created, and I take no accountability for this is a group of great people that work in multilingual services, gathered together to collect what could linguistic accommodations look like in online settings. So they created this table and broke down, listening, speaking, reading, and writing. What accommodations would we see that we need to do for our kids? And then what would they look like in remote settings? So for example, for listening, if the linguistic accommodation says using gestures and movements to provide linguistic support, well, you might use Screencastify or some kind of video. So you're basically showing the kids and doing all these gestures, and linking it to your presentation or your class when you're doing it, if you're not having a live session with them. So this document, it was created for in-house use, and it was shared with a few people. And in the summer, TEA created a document, which was a strong start, the implementation guide for English learners. And it breaks down the information, like what are some of the things you need, for programming and for services for the kids. And on the last page, under methods and resources, the Aldine ISD document was linked because there was a comprehensive document that included your 4 domains and just a starting point, some ideas for teachers to go into and say, okay, I can go here, let me try these things first. By all means, there's many additional things that we can try, but we wanted to have a starting point for our teachers. I'm sure we need to update it and add some things. But like I said, this was a good start for our teachers. And we've been able to share it in a couple of our meetings because, we knew everybody was like scrambling for ideas, and we were able to like send these out and say, well, try some of these things and let's see how it works.
I used to work with at a university in San Antonio and training new teachers, and many of them started their first year of teaching in the pandemic. And I think, learning how to teach, right, is all one thing, and learning, how to practice these scaffolding skills and things like that. And then using these online tools in a way that could best serve our students and help scaffold our learner in their learning process is just really important information. And I know we had a question in the chat about, are these kind of free resources for your students? It seems like some of these are probably like district adoptions, as you kind of mentioned earlier, right?
There's a combination of free resources and some things that were in-house. Like I said, we're definitely at a point that we should update some of the resources because it's been
I'm sure it's changing.
Increased. We've tried so many things.
Yeah.
But the other thing that's been very valuable is that the training that happened back in the spring, it's almost a year ago, it still continues to happen. Because like it happens with our students, just because we taught it doesn't mean they learned it. And until you start doing the things, you don't know what you don't know. So there was a lot of training, initial training for Schoology. Well, now maybe we're coming back to fine tune things. And like you mentioned, we're getting new teachers, and we're getting new teachers throughout the year in the middle of the pandemic.
Right.
So we have to be able to have these resources. We have a professional learning department that is very supportive and has ongoing basic training for teachers, but they also do monthly trainings specifically for teachers of ELs. And we're able to delve deeper. And every time there's a training, we try to include some kind of piece of technology, so that way we're experiencing it and we're trying it out, and then we can, practice it later. just trying to model what we want to see in the classrooms, and it's moving along.
Yeah, I think everything's going to continue to evolve, right? That whole feedback loop, it's all an iterative design. And I think, you know, teachers are going to find what's working in their classroom, what may not work for somebody else's classroom, so, or student. So I think for sure this list is going to grow more and more and more as we progress. You know, Grace, we appreciate all the wonderful points that you've covered in today's webinar discussion. We do have, looking at the clock, we do have about 5 minutes to end with any burning questions or comments from our participants. I don't mind stopping the webinar to answer questions as they come, so everything's timely and relative in the moment. But again, we'll save the last 5 minutes for any kind of Q&A. If anybody is kind of finished and you have to move on, I'll drop in the chat our email addresses. So if you want to contact myself about the publishing of all these resources later, or Grace directly, there are our email addresses are here. But again, we're going to hang back for just a few minutes to answer any questions. I think one popped in the chat. Feel free to unmute yourself or drop it in the chat, whatever you prefer. I see one here. About dual language programs. Is it normal for students to attend one day of English instruction without translation and another day to a Spanish instruction class where the activities are totally different from what they learned in the English class? Do you have any thoughts on that one?
So two-way dual language programs, because this seems to be like a two-way dual language program, are very district specific. I will have to say that. Even though we have the you know, your overview framework of, you know, what you want to create, there is a type of program that does one day in English and one day in Spanish. That program does exist. There should be a continuation, because there should be a curriculum written for that. And just like we provide students scaffolding, like our multilingual learners, just like we provide scaffolding for them to learn English, we should be doing the same thing in cases that we have non-English learners. They need the scaffold to learn in Spanish. So that should be provided through the training that the teachers are receiving. And like I said, in the development of their program. There are dual language programs that do half the day in English and half the day in Spanish. And part of dual language is making those cross-linguistic connections. So we should have teachers helping students make those connections. But I can't speak to a particular type of program that is not necessarily how we're doing it. Because that's part of the programming and curriculum writing that happens at the districts.
Yeah, that's a great response. Awesome. Well, we'll hang tight for a couple more moments to see if there are any other questions from our participants. I see a few have jumped off the call. You're welcome. Here's one more here. What are you seeing regarding students with disabilities who are also English learners?
What I'm seeing is not that different that we would always see with our students. This is something that we're still trying to work out the kinks as a state in regards of the guidance and information we're receiving from the departments together. We have seen a disconnect in the information we receive from one department and the other. We know that the timelines are very different, the timelines for EL and the timeline for special education. At the end of the day, this requires collaboration from both departments at the district and at the campus level. We share students, and these students must receive the services that they're entitled to under both sets of umbrellas. One is not more important than the other one. Both go together, again, at the state and federal level. So there's the process of identification, then there's the process of the placement, and then there's the process of the services. And the departments have to work together to make the best decision for each student as it regards to their specific disability and their needs and their language needs. So the difference this year is we might have to do things slightly different because of the virtual piece.
Great response. Thank you so much. Well, I see that it is 3 o'clock. So thank you again, Grace, for all of this important information. We appreciate all who have attended and participated in today's discussion on the impact of COVID on emergent bilingual education. You can learn more about IDRA educator resources and IDRA EX South at www.idra.org. You can also review and share today's webinar after this over. It will be recorded and shared online with all of its attached resources and related content on our website. We will see everyone at our next webinar. Until then, take care. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Grace.